So thank you, everyone, for coming. Good evening. Oh, I guess I should pay attention to this mic. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm Glenn Wharton, chair of the UCLA Getty Interdepartmental Program in the Conservation of Cultural Heritage. I'm very excited about this because this is our first campus lecture since 2019. We've been conducting these distinguished speaker lectures over the last 4 years, but they've all been remote. And we didn't know, would people show up? And you all have, so thank you for coming. And the reason why we're able to do this is because we got a special gift from Jeff Cunard, a good friend of the program and a good moral supporter of all that we do. So thank you, Jeff, for helping us in this regard. We'll be having annual campus lectures with his support. The aim of the lecture series is to invite speakers in adjacent fields to discuss issues of cultural heritage conservation. Our speaker tonight, who I'll introduce in a moment, is in cultural heritage conservation, but she's in built heritage conservation, and we do movable cultural heritage conservation. So in my mind, she qualifies as being in an adjacent field. Plus, she's just great, as you'll find out. But before I get into that, I just wanted to let you know that UCLA acknowledges I want to get this right, that we are a land grant institution, and we recognize the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional caretakers of the land that we're on, the Tovangar, which comprises the Los Angeles Basin and the South Channel Islands. And in our program, we do a lot of work with Tongva and other Native colleagues in a number of community-based projects. A number of our students are actually Indigenous, or they're interested in working with Indigenous cultural heritage on research, conservation, and even repatriation. So there's a lot going on in our program and on campus, a real strong recognition of the importance of the Tongva people and colleagues who have so long been ignored in our field, which is one of the reasons why I invited our speaker, Julianne Polanco, who is the State Historic Preservation Officer. She's been very active for many years on community engagement with Indigenous communities and other communities. And I'm particularly interested in this title that she sent. I've been looking at it for, well, ever since she sent it. If I can find it now in my notes, or maybe I'll just try to read it. Every word is sort of potent. Historic preservation, relevancy, community, and resilience in a changing climate. And this phrase, changing climate, really caught my attention because I thought, oh, climate change, when I first read it. And she said, changing climate. So that got me thinking about something I'm going to want to ask her about if she doesn't bring it up herself, about our changing climate and the importance of the work that she's doing in California to really develop California as a model, a state model for historic preservation in this era of climate change and the recognition of the importance of engaging Indigenous and other communities. So she's and her agency have become a real model for that I think other states will be able to look for in this changing climate that we're in right now. Julie has also worked internationally, so she hasn't just worked at the state level, the local level. She's been involved nationally for years, and maybe we could get her to talk about some of the work that she's done on an international level, and maybe even the COP conference that's just ending up right now in Azerbaijan. So who knows, we may go in various places with her talk. But you didn't come here to listen to me, you came here to listen to her, so I will ask her to come up to the podium now. And afterwards, she said that she'd rather have a conversation. So she's going to talk for a while And then we're going to both go over here and have a conversation. Then we'll just open it up so we can all talk. And then following that conversation, we can all go out there. There'll be a reception. So please, everybody, join us out there and for further conversation. Julie.
Thank you, Glenn. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. Can you all hear me with this? Perfect. Speak up. Okay. This, I know I couldn't hear you. Let's see. Better? Better? Okay. So thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the sponsorship and inviting me here today. Really appreciate it. It's nice to see you all, that you've taken the time to come and have a conversation with us about, I think, what's really the most important thing in our period, in this space that we're in. It really is. I was specific about not saying climate, but changing climate, because that work, I think, has many different meetings. I sent a title book to the election, so it really could talk about it, but I think the environment of historic preservation and conservation is changing as well, and so it just seemed like a more appropriate title to encompass many of the things that I hope we'll engage with today. I've had the honor of being State Historic Preservation Officer since 2015, first by Governor Brown and now reappointed by Governor Newsom. Do you want me just to hold this? Okay.
You can totally hold it.
Okay, I might just do that because I don't know that you can hear me. And I just thought I'd give you a bit of a background about what our office does. So we're a regulatory agency I'm appointed by the governor. Every state has a state historic preservation office, similarly appointed by their leadership. When we implement state and federal programs. So the National Historic Preservation Act, any project that uses federal funds or has a federal permit is required to consider its effects to historic properties, consult with tribes and communities and interested parties. We administer a federal historic tax credit program. We will launch next month. We're very excited to launch a state historic tax credit program. So it's an additional 20% on the 20%. So we're really excited about that. And hopefully the first round of $50 million will go very fast. The legislature will see fit to fund more programs to help rehabilitate buildings and also meet the needs of housing and other public needs that we have in our state. We administer a federal National Park Service program that helps certify local governments. So governments, city and county of LA is a CLG, doing survey work, working with their communities to understand resources and how to best account for them and steward them. And then there's a 9-member commission, State Historical Resources Commission, appointed by the governor in various technical positions, and 2 public members. They administer the designation programs that we have and help us with state policy. The 4 programs on the top that I've listed are those designation programs. We also hold a State Historical Resources Information System, CRIS, so it's the historic resources of the state of California, documents about archaeology and built environment. I will give a little foreshadow that we are working with Arches to take our program into the next century, and we'll be rolling that out next year. So we're really excited to be in that platform and have that nexus with the Getty. And then we just generally give preservation guidance and work in partnership with our state and federal agencies and our public to understand what the resources are that people find interesting, where they live, work, and play, and how we can steward them, protect them, and sometimes document them in different ways depending on what happens with them. So as a human, I want a just low carbon and thriving world for all. And I think it's a good place to start. What does that sort of really mean? In 2017, the president of Fiji, when leading the United Nations Conference of Parties, or COP, Fiji, the very small island, welcomed 10,000, 20,000 people to their island to talk about climate change and see it in real time in real places. And in that culture, he told of a tradition called the Talanoa Dialogue. It's an open and inclusive decision-making process that has no blame and no finger pointing, and everyone has a role. It's designed to help, it was designed to help countries implement and enhance the nationally determined contributions by 2020, so the goals of the world, the UN on climate. And so they invited members of the public communities to use this process where they lived. California did several of them, and create interventions that were then used as the guiding documents for the subsequent COPs, including the one that is finishing up this week in Baku, Azerbaijan. I like this because it really does talk about how we all need to work together, and it asks a series of questions that we use often in many of the frameworks that we work in our office. Where are we now? Where do we want to go? And how do we get there? When I accepted this role in the 5th largest economy in the world, I spent a lot of time considering what type of leader I wanted to be. I wanted to make sure that we were engaged, inclusive, that we were inspiring, always learning, connected, and contributing to the bigger conversation. That we were approachable, available, responsive, and a really good partner. I think it's really important, especially when you're sitting in a state agency role or in a high-level government role, that we really make sure that people feel, know, and understand that we work for them. And how do we do that well? And how do we do that often? How do we best serve our community? Fortunately, Governor Jerry Brown encouraged us to create frameworks for California with the realization that others might not be able to do for themselves. They might not have the financing, the political or social will. And so we always had, and Governor Newsom in his leadership has continued to carry this torch of do for California and create frameworks to help others. So in that sense, we are working on projects that, with that in mind, always, how do we help our public? How do we listen to them? How do we make sure that we're making good decisions? And then how do we help make that applicable to other people who don't? This is a project under the Federal Historic Tax Credit project process at Pier 70 in San Francisco, the former Bethlehem Steel shipyard. This building on the right is the interior of a building that was raised 10 feet to accommodate sea level rise. You can see it's a kind of a glass and corrugated shed. It looks really delicate, and they were successful in raising this building. The one on the left, I'm not sure what's happening with it, but how do we take these historic buildings, regardless of how they were constructed? Do we keep them? What does that look like? And how can they have a useful life? The building on the right is now a SpaceX building, so they're creating satellites that they're sending up, and so it's really kind of an exciting industrial use for a building that had a deep industrial history in San Francisco. In 2018, California and Mayor Bloomberg of New York hosted the Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco. Like-minded cultural partners, scientists, government, community leaders banded together, and we were successful in getting the first cultural heritage officially affiliated session in a climate change summit session at that event. We gathered folks from around the world to talk about a very expanded definition of culture to include the arts and museums, archaeology, indigenous communities. We really wanted to think about how all of these values play an important role in the health of our communities and how we could help safeguard cultural heritage to make sure that people thrived into the future. This is an example of the Klamath River. There were 7 dams total, 4 very large structures that you can see here that were hydroelectric power plants that themselves historic properties that have literally been blown up. This is a picture of the Copco 2 dam in its implosion. The value of taking these historic properties and documenting them, moving them out of the way for a greater biodiversity solution and resolution for the tribes, for the fish, for the environment, was a very long process, maybe 25 years. When I came to my role in 2015, we were talking about it then. The documents got signed and the buildings got blown up this year. So sometimes we have to make solutions and decisions about removing historic resources. But the goal, I think, and what we're trying to promote is how do we do that with the best information? How do we do that with the best science? Who's participating in helping make those decisions? And how are we getting that information so that we can make those decisions well thought out rather than on the back of a napkin or in a very big way. We work with 109 federally recognized tribes in California, 150 total tribes. California is the second largest tribal population in the country. The respect of their knowledge, the inclusion of it in combined with modern science is really catapulting our information in ways that we've been absent and missing. They've known all along, and we're grateful that partnerships and relationships with our tribes and other Indigenous communities, adjacent communities, so people who might not be Indigenous but have a tie or a hold to places for centuries. What are their voices? What's their participation? And how can we all do better together? This is a graphic of the fires in Summerland in Santa Barbara County post-fire, and what I think is compelling about it, in addition to it's just very pretty, it's just the patterns of fires that happened in that place. It jumped the freeway. It was very catastrophic and a very unusually fast and hot fire that melted the freeway as well. We're seeing these rapid events in flooding, in rain, in fire, where things are faster, hotter, more water very quickly. And in this case, there was a big rain afterwards, and so all that very loose dirt and the upheaval of the fire then was compounded by heavy rains, flooding, and this kind of thing. Lots of, I think there's a lot of agriculture at some of those spaces. So how are we as cultural heritage folks looking at what our resources are, but also how are we contributing to overall solutions that help combat these and also safeguard resources and places that people love to live, work, and play? So climate action, I think, is what we're really called to do, however we call ourselves, an architect or an engineer, a mother, a teacher, a historian, or in my case, a regulator. Pardon? Because it's really about communities and people in places and safeguarding them, we want to build capacity for a thriving future in tandem and in partnership. So how do we get there? California has a climate change goal mandate that it started in reporting in 2018 with Safeguarding California. We were able to include a section on cultural heritage in that overall statewide climate change goal. It's one of the few in a big government setting, and we're really proud of being able to add that to the state's ambition, not as a standalone conversation, but integrating it in air, waste, water, all of the different media that we're working on in the state to really think about how we're working on climate change. The Cultural Resources Climate Change Task Force was then formed, led by my office and the Native American Heritage Commission, where we gathered the heads of all state agencies in California to talk about where culture played a role in the projects they were already doing. So rather than saying, give us $5 million to do two things, how are we integrating ourselves into what you're doing for greater connectivity, more holistic solutions, and greater ambition? And COVID hit. So we took the International Congress of Monuments and Sites, ICOMOS's Future of Our Past document, which is a primer about cultural heritage and climate change, and we used it as a book club. So how did we raise awareness for very smart, very intelligent climate change folks in state government who didn't have any idea about cultural heritage, how to integrate it, what to do, but were very interested? So for 2 years, we had a book club. And we looked at this, we talked about it, we had things, we had meetings, we did lots of Zooms. And then there were projects that happened. So the Klamath Dam, you saw that one, that was informed a great deal by the tribes and by the partnership that was with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. The California Arts Council had a grant program for areas that were affected by disasters such as fire and flood. And what they did is take some of their grant funding in Humboldt County and in Paradise, those very large fire-stricken areas, and try to help people recover. And so we have an example of a mural that was built by the community with, in part, things that were found in the rubble of the places that had burned. And we have a story from a woman whose children had perished. The mural that the town built together was being constructed to help them recover and honor these children. And the mother tells us this story that she went to the community center and she started just sorting out little bits by color. And then she started working on a butterfly. And by the time the mural was finished and the community celebrated its installation, she said she felt like she could move on. She could start to recover. She could start to have her life back after that tragedy. So the importance of art and recovery, of culture and community, was a really big part of a result of the work that we did together. The California State Library is working on cultural institution adaptation plans in conjunction with California State Parks. The State Lands Commission had mitigation for a land exchange in which they sponsored a National Register of Historic Places historic district for 14 or 15 tribes on the Eastern Sierra. So how did that big, large 65,000 acre landscape get documented? And it did because of an exchange and a mitigation. The California Energy Commission has been doing lots of projects with tribes in the desert for years. And then they've also done something called a tribal energy gap analysis, where they looked at where the tribes needed to have energy security and are helping with grant funding for those things. Many of these programs were already happening. They were enhanced by the knowledge and the participation of folks in those awareness or book club that we had together. At the same time, the Global Climate Action Summit incubated something called the Climate Heritage Network. And it's a voluntary group of people around the globe, so not just in California, who are interested in the things that I've just been talking about and that many of you are working on. We were banded together in 5 continents with groups to look at things like carbon reduction of buildings and adaptation of buildings. In California, we're very lucky that we have a state historic building code that allows for meeting of codes in a performance way rather than a prescriptive way. So we're used to adapting buildings for earthquakes. Now we're adapting them for sea level rise and for fire hardening. We're already good at this, so we're sharing in that space with those folks. The roles to illuminate the roles of art, culture, and heritage in this more expanded definition, and the roles they play in not only solving adaptation and mitigation of climate change, but also in helping people change their behavior so they can help reduce their carbon footprints and their effects on the earth. So how do we solve an anthropological problem? We need human solutions. And so the Climate Heritage Network has been in place since then. We've just received a $1.5 million grant from the Mellon Foundation to do 4 things. One of them is to support the organization, which is great because it was on life support. Everybody are professionals in their own right. To look at that carbon calculator and some building initiatives in conjunction with Architecture 2030 and the American Institute of Architects. There's a project I'll talk about in a minute called Preserving Legacies that's funded by National Geographic that's doing the same kind of climate assessment work that we're doing. California, I'll tell you about those a little bit more, to help fund a community of practice. So once people have gotten together in these assessments, how do we create a resource for them to learn from each other and share with each other for greater learning? I just find this slide interesting, even though it was 2014, just to look at the staggering amount of drought. And if we don't believe that there's climate change, we just look at these maps and it tells us that something's happening and it compels us to address it. One of the projects that we have been focused on in our office with the Scripps Institution of Oceanography is to take climate vulnerability assessments that are in the environmental world and infuse cultural heritage, indigenous community knowledge. What are those values, the human values that have been missing from those assessments, to create these holistic decision-making documents, really. They don't solve problems. They're not telling people how to do work, but we're inviting people to the table. Who's there? What do they want? What do they value? What resources do they need? What knowledge have they not been sharing for whatever reason now that they are sharing with us? And we're creating these decision-making tools that really are more inclusive and hopefully will help us get there. One of the things in these documents and these processes that we're working on also is, once we're finished with our 2 pilot projects, making them open source. So we want to make them available, going back to the how are we helping those that don't have the capacity or the resources to help themselves. This is a bit of a framework about how we're doing that. And when we're starting this process with Scripps and these very smart, wonderful scientists, we're also working with the indigenous communities in the pilot projects we have at China Camp, Marin County, around the North San Francisco Bay. Our final project is at the Tijuana estuary, so on the border, and we're working on a cross-border project. So Mexico, the indigenous communities of Mexico and California, and the governments on that side are all participating. So we're looking at the total Tijuana estuary and not just the bifurcated US part. So how do we challenge ourselves to look at a binational, really intense border area to solve these problems? We're not just picking easy things. We're really challenging ourselves to think about things that people need help with and how we're doing that. So we're taking frameworks that exist. We're borrowing from everyone else. In the architecture world, we say we're paying homage to somebody, we're stealing their ideas, we're building upon them, and we're making them better, and then we're going to give them away. At the same time, we're working with the Preserving Legacies project that is funded by the National Geographic. It's on its third round, creating these climate vulnerability and assessment processes. At the same time, we're learning from each other. An example is when we started at China Camp in our work, we gathered everybody together and we were very excited, and we got down and we started the first meeting and we fell flat on our faces. And we couldn't figure out why. We had all the right people at the table, we had all the community members, but what we didn't think about was that everybody came to the table with the same sort of power dynamic that they've always had. And some people didn't understand the terms, some people didn't understand different terms. And so what we learned was we needed to back up, and we needed to ask people, what did they each need to get to that place of starting on an even keel with everyone else? So Preserving Legacies did that in the first project we had here at Petra in Jordan 2 years ago. They learned from what we failed, started off by giving each community group the opportunity to have a one-on-one session to learn, so we could learn what they needed to help them build their capacity. And then when they were ready, we started. And it really made for an exciting and more connected and more robust first pass at a site that's very known, but is still now being affected by severe flooding. The first time that many of the communities in Petra, such an old place, hadn't been included or asked if they wanted to have an opinion. These are the rice terraces of the Philippines, and in the Preserving Legacies first round project, it was our second case study, and this just an amazing landscape that is suffering from a changing climate that is having new bugs coming and eating the crops, the rice crops. It's also suffering from a bright flight, so there's not people that are staying around to manage these crops, and so they're trying to figure out how to change their culture of who accepts the land next to continue to tend it. And they're also trying to think about different kinds of rice that will still meet the cultural needs, but might be able to be more adaptable to the climate that they're in. This place is so far north that the Spanish never got there, and when you get there, it's 14 hours on a bus. It's almost like you've been transported in a time machine. It's still so very ancient in both the culture and the geography. This is just an example of a burnt out historic home at the Paradise Fire, and just the absolute devastation that we're seeing in these fires because they're so very hot. I live in Marin County on the top of a hill, and I often sit there and watch the quail get on the fence. And some days when I'm trying to noodle through how to solve a problem, I watch them, and they'll send one over, and then that one will look around, and then the next one will go, and then it'll scurry back. Usually it's the women that go first. I don't know why. And then at some point they all go and they do their thing, they bathe in the dirt and they eat their food and they have a big chat. And I feel like those quails remind me that that's what we really need to be doing. So for the state of California, we're going in first because we can. We're calling our folks down, we're bringing everyone together, we're having a little bit of food, we're having a big chat, and hopefully we're going to be able to solve problems together. This is Big Sur that suffers these gigantic landslides just about every year, and this was last year's. So how do we think about our behavior in contributing to this kind of event? And then also, how do we safeguard our heritage and, most importantly, our people from the effects? This is, I'll just finish with going back to the Talanoa dialogue again, because I think it really is such an open, honest, inclusive, non-judgmental process that we use a lot. this was from that COP in 2017, where people just sat on the ground and had a conversation and made some really good improvements and headway on ambitions and goals for all of us in the world of climate change and cultural heritage that we're using in Baku today. And it's a very exciting, really the first time that, that the global community went to a small, very culture inclusive, very tiny island to see firsthand what was happening. It wasn't an assumption, and it wasn't a guess. It was happening right before their very eyes. So that's it.
Now, as promised and as Julie requested, we're both going to sit over there and have a conversation. I have so many questions for you. I don't know if this is going to be a conversation or just me asking you questions, but
However you'd like.
the first question, well, I also have to say, should I be talking into this? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Is that working? No. It's green. How about now? Ah, okay. Got it. I have to talk right into it. As you were talking, I kept evolving questions in my mind, and then you would answer them. But I thought, okay, let's go deeper. So the first thing I'd like to do is just ask you about something that I brought up in the introduction, which is about California. You make me very proud to be a Californian,
Thank
I have
you.
to say. Could you talk a little bit more about what I'm wondering about, which is, in what way is California a model at this moment of changing climate for other states to look at? What are you most proud of that your office is doing among all the things that you presented?
Well, I think I'm most proud of the partnership and the engagement with unusual suspects, I say, in many different ways. So we're engaging with the communities where culture is most present still in their lives, people that are attached and engaged in the places that we're looking at. But we're also engaging with developers, and we're engaging with federal agencies, and we're looking at models that already exist. And we're trying to figure out how we can do better together and what does that really mean. Because we don't have time to meet the urgency and everybody still continue to do their own thing. That's where we are. If everyone continues to do what they're doing, we're going to get nowhere. There's not enough funding or human capital to get finished or to complete what we're doing. So how are we going to work smarter and better together? And I really believe that, and my experience has been that when we explain to people in the air, water, waste developers, what it is we're trying to accomplish, everybody wants to help bolster their communities. So where do we find these things that engage people smarter with the limited resources that we all have, and share the knowledge so that we can meet this urgency on a more rapid scale globally? So I think I'm most proud of finding those avenues, testing them out, tinkering with them, picking ourselves up after our failure, and continuing to move forward.
That was the easy one. Now I'm going to ask a hardball. You talked, I mean, it was very interesting with the Tijuana example. You said you failed and you learned from that. And then the next example that you gave was in Petra, where you said people learn from your failure, but it's not your failure, it's everyone's failure that tries to do this. And I think I know very well the sort of the texture of that failure. But could you go a little bit deeper and just give us some examples? Because we deal with this in movable cultural heritage as well, and I do have some other things I want to say about that. But maybe first you could just tell us, just dig a little deeper, like how is it if you bring people to the table who maybe aren't used to being at the table because they've been excluded from the table in the past, and they don't know what to do, or the power dynamics are still there. How does a group of people then go about addressing those power dynamics in order to have a more productive collaboration around the table?
Right. So we learned to slow down at the beginning, take a little bit time. And the work I do with tribes, or that we do with tribes, I feel like I'm a very culturally sensitive person. I have the great fortune of coming from a deep culture of really amazing, lovely Mexican Americans in California and Texas, and part indigenous. So I feel very lucky that I was raised in that world. And yet I am learning every moment. When you work with tribal leaders and they're in a group of people, one will speak and then there's a bit of a silence. And we as Western people always want to fill that void. We're always hurrying up, right? We got to hurry. And in Indian country, that's exactly the opposite. Somebody will say something and everyone's quiet. And what they're doing is listening and they're thinking and they're connecting. And then somebody will talk and this happens. So things take longer. But what we've also learned, and what I've also learned, the value of that is they might take a little longer at the beginning, but there's so much more at the end. And so how do we get out of our own way as practitioners, as people? How do we use culture to learn every day to bind us better together? And so I think that that's really was the key that we learned that was helpful in Petra, a deep, steep culture, people from all the world flying in. How are we going to tell them what to do with their place? We started by asking them what they wanted. We met with them first as a group and just explained the process. Then we offered those meetings and people took us up on it. We met them where they were. We met a group of women who were not allowed to own a business and did anyway. And their business was collecting seeds they couldn't find for the bread that they wanted to make. They didn't know they were creating a cultural seed bank. They didn't even know what that was. We went to them, we went to their bakery, we sat in their place, and we did this with all the community groups that were interested, children's groups and the Bedouins and the government agencies. We met with the Minister of Culture, we met with the Minister of the Environment because we wanted his science. And then we got back together when everybody was ready. We let them tell us when they felt that they'd asked all the questions that they needed to feel like they were ready. And that waiting seemed to us in a Western way to be lack of progress. But the acceleration after that made us move beyond the schedule that we had and in a more complete and a better way.
Thank you. That really resonates with the world that I inhabit, which is, as I've said, movable cultural heritage and its preservation. And now I will talk for a minute, and then we can really have a conversation. In our world, which is the museum world, or at least my world, cultural heritage conservation developed since the 19th century as a science. And we really defined ourselves as scientists, people who could research the materiality of objects from the past, learn about how they were made, how they deteriorated, and the methods that we can use to slow down or even reverse methods of deterioration. So it was all about materials and science. Of course, we look at artist intentions and maybe cultural meaning, but that would come in later. And it's only been in the last, 20 years or so that we've really started to think critically about the way that our field developed. And it's not that we're throwing science away at all. We still consider ourselves scientists, material scientists. It's that there's something missing. And some of those things that are missing are the people who are connected to the cultural heritage that we work on, meaning that they or their ancestors produced it and they don't have a voice in the research that we do, the conservation work that we do. So we have been, I think, moving in a really good direction, which is very parallel to what you're talking about, by slowing down, listening, trying to recognize who those people are that are not at the table, and then developing methods for bringing them to the table and looking at the power dynamics and looking at, should we be the decision makers here or should we be stepping back? And I think every situation is very different. Another thing that we've missed is the fact that people have been taking care of their cultural heritage forever. There are traditional methods of caretaking that we just ignored in our field. And now we're starting to look at them. We have a number of students actually we have a PhD student who just finished her dissertation who is looking at the tradition in some museums in India of using leaves from the neem tree in textile storage to drive insects away. So it's a very natural, locally sourced method of dealing with pests in museums. And we never even looked at that, took it seriously. So what she did was hung out with people that were using these methods, learned about them, talked to them. She grew her own neem tree and did chemical analysis to find out what was going on, which insects actually were driven away, what was it effective. So she brought material science and chemistry to this question. And I think now the next step would be to work with people in India and say, hey, I've learned this. Let's figure out how we can collaborate to maybe even bring neem leaves to US museums. I don't know what the future of that is, but so yeah, does that sort of resonate with what you're doing?
It does. And I think in thinking about how people, like we should meet people where they are, of course we always should, but what does that really mean? And I think the physical meet people where they are, but also meet people where they are. The Preserving Legacies just finished a climate vulnerability assessment project in Cartagena, Colombia. And they went to the island that's just over the water, and fishing communities of various, very unperformally educated folks, lots of different languages being spoken. And they did a climate literacy workshop. What they decided was their community needed to understand terms of climate literacy. What do these things mean? Fundamentally, or they couldn't go anywhere. But the youth of this community was trying to figure out how they could engage themselves and the elders in a way that, so they have a game called Loteria that's like a bingo in their culture. And so these young people, not high school age yet, made a Loteria game with climate terms. And then they went to community centers and schools and different places and held meetings and played the game. And this is how they got the climate literacy in their community in a way that felt interesting, important, connected to them in a way that people understood. So it wasn't so overwhelming. I love that. I didn't get to see it. I've seen some of the cards, but just the kids doing it. So in that case, how are we engaging who's taking over? And often I'm the youngest person in the room, and I'm 60 this year. So that's a little frightening. So who's coming behind us, and how are we making sure that we're not just talking to that generation, but we're holding the door open and saying, what do you want? And how are you going to take this from us? And how do we help facilitate that? So that level that you spoke of has many different layers. It's youth, it's people who don't know the terms because they're in a different field, people who don't have a different level of education. In Jordan, I go back to those women. They came to us and said, we don't know how we're going to contribute, until we sort of told them, you're saving your culture with the seed bank. And then they made us food. So they were really important to our well-being, and they felt happy nourishing us because we were nourishing them. So making sure that everybody has a role if they choose to, and in a way that speaks to them, and making sure that everybody feels like their role is on par with the scientists and the knowledge holders and the matchmakers that we are in this process.
Okay, I still have more questions, but I'm also not worried, I'm just aware that maybe people in the audience have questions. And we could just open it up now, or I could continue. Yes. Why don't we?
And I'm really interested in it. I just got back from Australia, and on the airplane, the Qantas Air, the first thing after the pilot introduced himself was to thank the native people, the Aborigines of Australia, for their land and for the settlers and everyone else who came to Australia. And it was a shock to me. We never get on an American airline and they say, thank you, Native people. So, and that happened all the way through my visit to Australia last month. So I'm very surprised. But the other thing was the preservation there, they've lost 1/3 of um, uh, their native plants. 1/3 is extinct, and they're in the process of building it back. And it's the Aborigine people, the different tribes that they've brought back in to show what it is, how it was used, what the history of it is. And I spent 12 days in the desert, in the arid land botanical garden, and related. I was fascinated. We would never see that here for a native people.
Do you want to respond?
It's happening. Yes, they are. They're doing amazing things in Australia, and our governor has a tribal advisor who is now a cabinet secretary level, and she herself is an enrolled member of a Pomo tribe, and she's just spent a month in Australia and New Zealand on an exchange similar to what you're suggesting, and talking about how we can learn from them and they can learn from us, both in government and in the Indigenous communities. I think that in the work that we're engaged with, we're seeing a lot more of things like traditional cultural burning as solutions for forest cleanup that's been neglected and is really important. So it's happening. It's probably not as public as it is in Australia at the moment because the tribes are controlling and deciding about the information share as they should. But it's happening, and it's happening more frequently, and we're getting better solutions, I think, and we'll see more of that coming forward. Now, land acknowledgements were something that California had been doing maybe for the last 5 years, pretty new. The tribes have asked us to stop doing that because in California anyway, because in their minds it was acknowledging something that nobody was doing anything to fix. So they've asked to stop the land acknowledgements and just engage them in their presence and changing the dynamics. So I think it's interesting to watch these things globally, the waves and how they're being dealt with, and really it speaks to the importance of the primacy of the Indigenous communities telling us how they wish these things to happen.
Thank you after giving a land acknowledgement tonight, but you
okay.
You did note that I've been feeling like just standing there and saying we acknowledge the land of the traditional caretakers isn't enough. And maybe you noticed that I immediately followed up by saying what we are doing and the kind of collaboration that we're doing within our program and working with our Tongva colleagues. But I'd also just like to respond to your comment by sort of referring to some research that I'm actually doing with 2 colleagues in the Netherlands right now. We're looking at the historical development of nature conservation, or particularly ecological restoration, and how that parallels with cultural heritage conservation, and what our field can learn from our colleagues in a parallel but very different world. And one of the things that we've identified is the exclusion of people. We're looking back to the wilderness movement in the 19th century, where national parks were founded or wilderness zones, which meant that people who had been living there all along had to leave because these were to be wilderness, non-inhabited by human beings. And it's very parallel to what's gone on in museums, where cultural heritage from various living peoples has been collected and put in museums, taken care of by professionals, but excluding the people associated with them. So we're just starting to look at parallels and look at evolving practices and theory to sort of identify ways in which we can learn from each other. It just made me think of that.
Great.
Anyone else? Yes.
Really, always great to hear you talk about all these, the work that you're doing there. It's really interesting to hear about what's been happening in California. And I had a question about that. I mean, you talked about, it was really interesting hearing about how you went about trying to get this kind of integration of heritage into kind of a greater range of policy processes, which we all say is the way we have to do it, it's kind of hard to get it to happen operationally. So I was really interested to hear about that. I had a more specific question, which was that, as you talked about, and we know this more and more, and Glenn, you alluded to this, we've talked about this too, that there are lots of traditional practices related to stewardship, which we know are really effective in contributing to sustainability, lowering carbon, managing climate, all of those different things. But modern life has increasingly ruptured these or continues to stand in the way of those practices and continuing often and sustaining these if we can get back to them, like the example of the going back to looking at traditional grain crops and things like that doing in Australia and things. But it's really important, and sometimes because of that rupture, we need policy level intervention to try and help provide the place, the space, the resources and the ability for people to continue that practice and to empower people to be able to continue those things and to reinforce it. And I was really interested to hear, from the position that you're sitting in now, do you have the ability to kind of get research done to help demonstrate the scientific efficacy of these things sometimes, firstly, and or is more of that needed? And secondly, have you had some potential to try and invigorate or catalyze that sort of policy that can reinforce, recreate whatever it is those practices there? And if you've got any examples, could you share those with us? Sorry, it's a long question.
I'm trying to capture the three things. I'll if I didn't get them, remind me. Thank you, Susan, for the questions. So I run a very specific, tiny little office that sits adjacent to California State Parks, and we have regulatory authority over a very narrow sliver of things: built environment, archaeology, tribal cultural resources, in the federal and state frameworks of any project that's happening, federal funds, we review them, and state-owned property. I was at a place where there was a transition between two governors, and so the old administration was interested in the curiosity that I brought to the table, and the new administration came and didn't understand that it was a curiosity and just let us go with it because they thought that that's what they should be doing. So we were really lucky to be in that moment in time. I have absolutely no authority over any of these people at all. But our agency, the California Natural Resources Agency and the governor's office and the Cal EPA, have taken on these ideas and then they've run with them because they do have the authority. So I'm sort of on the sidelines in many of these frameworks because I'm not involved in them. But for example, California State Parks is entering into memorandums of understanding with tribes about co-management. So the idea that land back, right? So everybody, here's an example. Everybody wants to give land back to tribes. Many tribes don't want land back. They don't have the capacity to steward them. Tribal leaders tell me it's like taking children that I can't feed. That responsibility is something I can't manage. So I need help managing it in a different way. So tribes are being asked what they need, how they can participate. So all of these agreement documents look very different depending on the needs and the situation of what's happening, whether it's running a visitor center in Humboldt County that's run by tribal youth, to systems and programs about energy security under the California Energy Commission. So there are examples, Susan. They are being recorded in California's, that Safeguarding California 2018 has a different name now. And there's also another document called the Fifth Assessment. So the United Nations, the UNFCCC has these assessment documents globally, what's happening in climate change report cards. California has modeled theirs to get over them to just be consistent. So these things are being recorded in those spaces. I don't know if anybody's doing any scientific studies about the efficacy of tribal traditions, for example, the burning, the tribal burning, and the success that's having over conventional cleanup, for example. But I think U.S. Fish and Wildlife or California Fish and Wildlife and Cal Fire are looking at those things as well. They're removing barriers to entry, for example, in the fire lines. When there's a fire, people have to have HAZWOPER training. It's hazardous materials training. The tribes don't have that. So tribes they're being trained so they can be on the front lines and help avoid the big dozers that are going through places, and sitting with CAL FIRE and saying, make your fire break over there instead of over there. So the barrier of tribes participating in those kinds of activities and in real time were these technical trainings that are being offered. The idea about who's the authority and the traditional cultural knowledge has in some legislation, and I'll see if I can find those examples, now gone on par with Western science. So as they're being raised, people are figuring out where the best place to fix them permanently is, or a longer term. And then they always need adjusting. Like, that's one thing I want to say is we're all learning as we're going along, right? We're like the puppy learning to run while we're tripping over our own feet. But so we also have to kind of like be a sailor and keep tacking and finding that wind, and sometimes stopping for a little bit and seeing what we did. But those things are happening and they're being recorded in those documents by others. So I brought up the idea, and I was kind of the fly in the ointment, and I'm really proud of that. And now I'm really even more proud that the people that should be working on it are doing so. It's where it belongs.
Other questions? Yes.
First I must confess I came late, so I'm looking forward to seeing the video. But I was thinking that I always felt very weird when they do this land announcements at Harmony Museum, the Willy Wonka Theater, or elsewhere, because it's just like token. But then I realized too that the best way actually to acknowledge their presence today is to recognize that there's so many of them that we can't see because we can't tell. More importantly is that Getty, Autry Museum did a really, really good exhibit, a few rooms, on their interpretations of the mission experience. And what's disappointing that it's not a permanent exhibit. This would be a wonderful permanent exhibit, because you can really, really feel how they see their past. And I'm thinking of all the fourth graders who go to mission and do the mission studies, and everything is nice and good. But to be able to see that is really amazing re-education. And then the second thing is you have I don't know where you're from, Getty, but Getty had an indigenous celebration every year. And this year there was a poetry reading by maybe four people after the Indian dance. And I thought it was very powerful to hear their experiences or their views from the poetry. So I was wondering, I think that the best way that even at Power Museum is to have more of those exhibits that share their experience and present their voices. And that way we can go beyond the token thing. The reason I say this is I went to, I'm sorry,
No.
but I went to Native American Center up near Lake Isabella, and I was listening to this author, Native American, read his books, and then he had a question and answer. And he said that he's in his 70s, that my biggest wish before I die is to get all the missions, all 21 missions, to release the names of all the people buried there. Both, they are very good, the Catholic Church is very good about baptism, death, marriage, or whatever. So there should be this data. So I thought, how could it be that we have 21 missions? I don't know who controls them, or is there any way that this kind of real historical data, genealogical data, can be put into a database or at each of the mission? So, 23andMe is so easy to do real research. But more importantly is, who controls this information?
Do you want to respond to
I can give you some information. So the 21 missions, all but 3 are still owned by the Catholic Church and the records. So Sonoma is a state park. La Purísima is a state park. I can't remember the third one. Lompoc, yeah. So the Catholic Church controls that information. I've been involved in the past 10 years in 2 different efforts. One, the UC system tried to create a mission trail system under the UNESCO World Heritage Framework with Mexico. So there was a UC Mexico initiative on the missions. And in that space, the Catholic Church didn't want to play. So they came to the first meeting and then never said they weren't going to participate. So I don't know what their level of cooperation is about these documents that you as you suggest. In our office, we have these things in the National Register of Historic Places framework called historic context statement. So when you write a National Register nomination, there's two parts to it. The first part is, what's the history you're talking about? And the second part is, how does the resource that you're looking at convey that history? We've backed ourselves up into this happy place of them being very scholarly and very professional, and it's great because the knowledge is really robust, but it also has barriers to entry because of those things. So our office has been conducting over the past several years these studies with community groups around the state. We hire a contractor to do the writing. We bring community groups together, scholars, and help us identify the themes. So we've done Latinos in 20th century California. We just finished African Americans in California. We've done 2 rounds of Asia Pacific and Islanders in California, Asia Pacific. The title I'm not getting quite right. And we also, for the first time, did one about the California missions from the tribal voice and experience. So we invited all 60 tribes who self-identified as affiliated with the 21 missions, and it took us 3 years to get to a place where they were ready to start. 30 tribes joined us. They were the primary source for the stories that are now in this document that's been approved by the Keeper of the National Register. It's not a perfect document. It's not as detailed or as big as I had hoped, but it's a really good start. And it's the first time that it's happened in the context of the National Register of Historic Places. So we have to just get started, right? And so we've offered this study to anybody who wants it. They're on our website. The tribes are really excited about them. We ran into a lot of barriers, including the Keeper of the National Register wanting to edit it. My staff kept wanting to edit it, and I kept saying, you're not the primary source. And so what we did instead was include a paragraph that said, the following information has been unedited and received from the tribes as they wish. They're written, they're digital. You can find them on the website of my office. They're available to anybody who wants them. No, we did not interview anybody on video. We didn't do any oral histories. Yeah. So we're trying to sort of start these things and bring these stories out of the shadow and pick up the places in the framework that we have. As I said, it's a very narrow sliver of a very bigger conversation that you're talking about. But that's what we're doing in those spaces to try and help bring more daylight to these stories from the voices of the people and their families who've experienced them.
I think we have time for one more quick question. Does anyone? Yes.
It's a quick question. I came in a little bit late, but could you expand a little bit on the, you said that there were some setbacks when you started the one project and you had to take a step back. Was it the cultural dynamics? Was it that the people had different solutions or ways about going about the problem that caused that setback?
Well, we didn't appreciate that people came to the table with the same dynamics that they've had for years. So, for example, California, and all of them were very thoughtful, interested people in making progress, right? So we had this meeting in California State Parks would say, we're very concerned about the uprooting or the sifting of archaeological sites, maybe remains at the edge of the bay. And then the tribes would stay silent for a couple of hours. And at the break, one of the tribal representatives came to me and said, we could care less about that. We're concerned about the plant materials and our seeds and the things that we need to sustain our culture and ourselves. And they continue to ignore it. So we didn't really, so everybody stayed in their space, which was never going to get us anywhere. And we just failed to recognize that in a way. So we stepped back and thought about where did we go wrong. Like the meeting was nowhere near as interesting or effective as we had hoped the first time. So we had to sort of dial back and say, where did we go wrong? What did we do wrong? And what we realized was we needed to help people feel that they were on an even playing field to then get started in a new framework. And once we did that, it was a whole different conversation. And the Jordan project implemented that from the beginning, and then they had a different success rate. Yeah.
Well, as I anticipated, Julie is an amazing speaker. She's doing so much good work for the within our state, and I'm so proud of our state, as I said before several times. But thank you all for coming. We will now go back into the reception area outside. So please, everybody join us out there. There is some food and drink, and we will continue the conversation.
Thank you all for coming.